Okay, I heard there will be heckling from people. So it's after lunch, so if you start to fall asleep, Sarah, Allie, we're counting on you. So I am privileged to invite you to join us in a panel on faith formation, Christian formation of young people on a college campus at Belmont University. So I'm going to let each one of you introduce yourselves because you'll do a better job than I will.
Thanks, Wendy, for moderating, and thanks, Steve, for inviting us. My name is Nathan Webb. I serve as Vice President of Whole Person Formation and Leadership Development at Belmont. I've been there 13 years. I came in as an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies. My background is in organizational communications or org behavior, leadership, those sorts of things. And now I get to do that sort of work, not just in the classroom, but across our institution at Belmont these days. So it's really been great. I grew up Baptist, and as a young adult, while in Baptist seminary, I became a Methodist. So my heart was strangely warmed. Forgive me for that joke. I'm sure it's made too often. Yeah, but I became a United Methodist Ball, serving at an internship at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City, and I've been a participating member in the Methodist congregation ever since. So it's good to be among you.
We'll try this. There we go. Ooh. Greg Jones, great to see a lot of familiar faces in this room. I now serve as president of Belmont University for the last 4.5 years. It's a very strange day for me because this brings a whole confluence of my life together. I am a John Wesley Fellow in one of the earlier classes, and actually my first paper I gave at a John Wesley Fellows conference, Albert Outler was sitting on the other side of the room looking skeptically at me as I tried to wax eloquent on Aristotle and Aquinas, and there's a guy who knew more, or probably forgotten more than I ever knew. But those days, and Steve Moore and I were prayer partners when we were graduate students back in the day, and then spent a lot of time here at Duke when Steve and Edgardo were talking about who are current Duke faculty. I thought, well, I'm not, but I'm emeritus here. I don't know what that means, but was here for a long time before moving to Belmont 4.5 years ago. So it's been wonderful to see a lot of you and to be here.
My name is John Whipfleet. I'm a rookie at Belmont, where I'm a senior scholar and program advisor in the president's office, and also working quite a bit in our university ministries office. I came to Belmont after 28 years at Calvin University, where I was the director of the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. The year before that, I spent here at Duke Divinity School, writing a dissertation on Trinitarian liturgical theology and auditing seminars by two amazing people. I've been thinking about them all day long, Jeffrey Wainwright and Grant Wacker. And to have those two teachers form me as I was writing that dissertation was a great gift. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge my dear friend Lester Ruth, who teaches here. Lester walked into my office my very first day as a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame and confidently announced to me that he was indeed a shouting Methodist. And it took one conversation with Lester to I think we're going to be really good friends. And it's been such a generative professional friendship, and I'm just grateful to be in this space. So.
Yeah, I would be remiss if we didn't introduce our provost, David Gregory, who has promised to lead the way with heckling. So Provost David Gregory, really phenomenal colleague. Glad he could be with us today.
So we'll start with Greg and just have you describe for us the approach for Christian formation that's Christ-centered at Belmont.
When Susan and I went to Belmont, the description in the mission statement was a student-centered Christian community, and Susan noted to me that seemed odd. She said, shouldn't we be Christ-centered? And for two reasons. One, Christ ought to be the center, not students. And second, undergraduates tend to already think they're the center of the universe, and we don't really want to say we're going to encourage that. And so she said, what if we said Christ-centered and student-focused? And I said, well, that sounds good, but let's not press it too quickly, because you don't want to come in and try to change the mission statement in your first few weeks. We were invited to go to the nursing faculty retreat, and so I just thought, well, we'll test it as an idea of thinking about Christ-centered and student focus. Before I could finish the sentence, there was this incredible applause and almost gasps of people resonating with it. And so I thought, oh, maybe we'll move quicker than I thought. And part of what drew Susan and me to Belmont was that there had already been a sense of a kind of broader ecumenical Christian community. There's a longer story of moving from affiliation with the Tennessee Baptists in 2005 to separating, but not doing what most of higher education did, which is drift into a kind of post-denominational secularity, but it doubled down on a real ecumenical Christian identity. And about a third of our students are Roman Catholic. We also have a pretty significant Coptic Orthodox community. Who knew that Nashville actually has more Coptic Orthodox churches and people than anywhere else in the country? Fascinating. I thought I knew a lot about Christianity, but when I see students on their application saying they are Sunday school teachers in their Coptic Orthodox church, I realized I have no clue what happens in a Sunday school class in a Coptic Orthodox church. But that ecumenical stretch and that resonance to that, as well as at least a strong implicit focus on character. And so I said, well, let's double down on that. We actually put Christ at the center into our seal, as well as the words character, purpose, and wisdom that happened by consensus. And so it was a significant sense of traction. But what we really wanted to do was to say, a lot of the programs on character, and there's been lots of funding from Lilly and other organizations, JTF, John Templeton Foundation, but they've been programs around the edges of institutions. And I thought, well, I only report to a board and a board chair, so let's just see what we might be able to do if we wove it across the institution. Not just in individual courses, but actually try to say, what would it look like to embed it in all of our colleges and have the deans responsible for working on it? And then also involving the whole staff. We changed the name to the Division of Student Formation instead of Student Activities or Student Life or Student Affairs, none of which particularly seemed like good descriptions. There's a really interesting book by Julie Rubin on the history of the 20th century in higher education and marginalization of moral formation by locating it in student life and student activity. So student formation, and then brought Nathan into this role to really weave it together and work closely with his colleague, Vice President for Student Formation, Tamika Wardlow-Williams, to say, student formation is going to happen as much in the dorms and in the cafeteria and in co-curricular kinds of activities as it does in the classroom. In fact, our athletics program arguably has been focused on Christian formation in pretty deep ways for multiple decades. So what we've tried to do, and the benefit of being in a place where I at least can have a bully pulpit to shape some conversation, is that we've been able to get the conversation going and gain traction across the university. So Nathan's role is actually to do it across the campus, both academic and non-academic. He reports to me, even though he works closely with David Gregory. And then John coming in, part of the recruitment of John and Charlotte was to say, if we're not figuring out how to do what John will probably describe as mosaic worship that can reach the Coptic Orthodox as well as the Hispanic Pentecostal and everything in between, then we're going to be missing the boat. And our worship in our chapel had gotten fairly thin, 2 praise songs followed by what was kind of a quasi-lecture that may or may not have been anything resembling a sermon. and trying to reweave that and now look more broadly at university worship. So they can tell you a lot more, because largely now my role is symbolic and I just try to frame some interesting things and they do all the really important work.
I find that interesting. A couple of years ago, I know some of you were there at the NetView conference. Megan Sullivan from Notre Dame talked about college students coming to their campus, and in one hand, they have all of their student life activities, and another, their academics, and then on their back, they bring everything that comes from home. And we think, as faculty members, often all the formation happens in the classroom. Student life thinks all of the formation happens in student life, or athletics and clubs, those things, and yet they also carry everything from home with them. So, that leads to just a curiosity of how you were able to, do the actual work of getting everyone to cooperate together. And then, what were the challenges and the where were the spaces that it was easy? You had a lot of buy-in, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, and thanks for that question. And just real quick before I answer it, I do want to just second if that any recommendation of Megan Sullivan's work. We've had her on campus recently and interact with her a lot, and really doing some interesting work, especially as we're thinking about what is humanity's role in the age of AI, and the Delta framework that they've come out with at Notre Dame. It's just really incredible work. So I just want to commend Megan's work. Big fan of hers. So forgive my speech teacher ways from back in the day, but I have 3 ways, 3 points here in which I think of 3 successes, and really it was hard to really distill it down to 3, because there has been a lot of momentum, but I'll also talk about plenty of challenges as well. So I think the first success that's come to mind, and I'm going to talk about from Greg's arrival 4.5 years ago. So I was there 8 years prior to his arrival. So I saw a real shift in the way we lived out our mission over that period. So I would say the first way that we've seen changes is a shared institutional commitment and language. And so what Greg's been able to do, I think, by casting a really compelling vision and then deputizing, if you will, a lot of leaders around campus, and those who are in positional leadership and otherwise, right? Those who have real influence around campus. He's cast a really, I think, amazing vision and let others lead. I think that's been really incredible. And so we've worked really hard to incentivize participation, whether that be just to get down to brass tacks, to getting down to course releases or stipends, but just letting people kind of catch the vision. Some of you are maybe familiar with the Jubilee Center, the University of Birmingham in England, and their framework on character education. They talk about character education happens in 3 ways: character being caught, taught, and sought. And I think before we got into the taught and sought, we really leaned into the caught, right? Like casting this big vision and holding up exemplars and let people getting excited about that work. And so there is this shared institutional excitement. Greg mentioned that prior, in the past, there was this sort of implicit focus on Christian formation, but now it's much more explicit, and not just in pockets as it was before, but really across the campus. And to help us get there, there's been, to this point, shared language has been huge. Greg mentioned being very crystal clear in our mission, vision language about what we're about, and Christian formation being central to that mission and vision. We've created a framework that focuses on, we call it the soul framework, and I have a nice little, my visual is not large enough for you to see, but Google it. And but we talk about, and this is really, when we think about what are the elements at Belmont that make us unique, or what do we hang our hat on, this was an attempt to try to answer that question. And so it's a framework, SOUL acronym, seeking excellence with the virtue of humility, offering gratitude with joy, unleashing hospitality with love, and living the dream together with hope. Right, and as we heard in our prior conversation, that's hope is something that the Christian faith can certainly really lean into heavily. And this whole framework being undergirded by wisdom and aspiring to greater wisdom. And we really try to not just make that a cool bumper sticker, right? Like that shared language, and trying to think about how is that lived out in class A, B, and C, in faculty development opportunity A, B, and C, in student club A, B, and C, right? And so really all kind of rowing in the same direction as far as mission and language. A second thing, and I'll be more brief with this one because it's just less exciting, but creating the infrastructure to really move this work forward, right? It's great to have this big vision and shared language, but then you have to do something with it, right? And so because of institutional support and external grant funding, we've been able to create an office, which is the Belmont Formation Collaborative that I get to lead. We're a team of 26 people who are solely focused on formation. The language we use is whole person formation, but it's distinctly Christian or Christ-centered at Belmont. And so we have people thinking about this every day, and our role, our purpose is to serve as a catalyst to infuse formation throughout campus. And so really putting your money where your mouth is in a concrete way has been important to moving this forward. And external funding has certainly helped us to move forward. And as you all probably, this is common sense, I'm sure, but external funding often leads to more internal funding, right? And it's this kind of virtuous cycle, if you will, right? So that's really been meaningful to create the positions and infrastructure. And the third one I want to talk about is just, and I won't get into any details at this point, I'll kind of come back to this a little bit later, perhaps, but really going all in on our programming and initiatives for whole person formation, not just with our students, but with our faculty and staff. I think that's been key, right? I mean, yes, we exist in a university to serve our students, right, among other things, but that seems pretty central to the mission, right, of a higher education institution. But I think what often doesn't happen in higher ed is pouring into faculty and staff in a really in a meaningful way, an ongoing way, as opposed to one-off programs, but making that central. Immediately you think you can broaden your impact, but then think about the downstream impact and some of you have been at the same institution for 20, 30 years, right? And the number of students that you can touch over that time. So really committing to our faculty and staff. And a couple quick challenges I'll mention. There is I mentioned that we now have a kind of a shared mission understanding, but we didn't start there. When people heard formation, they thought, or character education, for example, or vocation, right? That means a lot of different things to different people, and so we had to work through kind of creating a shared vocabulary. That's why it was so important, because people, in many ways, not in many ways, but in certain instances, viewed that language as maybe problematic, right? Devout Christians were like, well, what do you mean by that? Like they had a political sort of meaning in their mind. And I was like, we had to clarify what that meant. And so helping people understand what we mean by that. The second one I'll mention is just change fatigue. And this is in large part because Greg is a very different president than our prior president, right? They are both highly effective in their own ways, but kind of a different leadership style, I think. Kind of is putting it mildly. Like they just approach things differently, right? And anytime you create large-scale institutional change, there's a bit of whiplash that occurs, right? And so helping people, just being careful to not try to do too much at once and too quickly, and so to kind of putting a governor on innovation at times, but then still trying to innovate, and move forward. And the third one, and I'll say, and anybody who does work in the formation space I think would agree with this, it's really hard to sometimes measure success, right? That is an ongoing challenge for us, especially for funders. It's like, how do you measure a person's character development in the course of a 15-week semester? It's pretty hard, right? And so how do we tell, but if it is difficult, and I think it is, how do we tell the story to board members, to parents, right? And so just trying to think creatively about how you quote unquote measure, but maybe not using the typical metrics that you normally would. So that's a few successes, a few challenges we've encountered in the last almost 5 years.
Yeah, thank you. The metrics conversation is always so fascinating and challenging. So, John, you mentioned you had been at Calvin for 28 years. So talk to us about what it was about Belmont that drew you away from Calvin. And then if you could, tell us, about the opportunities to engage around formation and specifically get into Christ-centered worship.
So at Calvin, 28 years at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, I would describe the work in terms of 4 key words. First, worship, not surprisingly. So public worship, liturgical expression in all forms. Formation, intergenerational formation was the subtext of almost every event we worked on. Receptive ecumenism, especially in grant making, grants that went to a wide variety of denominations, zip codes, cultural contexts, and cross-cultural learning. Those are the 4 keywords. And I'm thrilled that the team at Calvin continues it forward in such good ways, and I'm thrilled to, right this minute, advertise for them that the Vital Worship Grants Program is awaiting your proposals for continued renewal. So it turns out those 4 keywords are exactly the same 4 keywords that I wake up every morning thinking about. And so it's very much a continuity in that way. Shaping a community of receptive ecumenism, people bringing the best gifts of their own tradition into a conversation, cross-cultural learning opportunities in a university context. Formation is obviously the leading keyword. So that's really all that's changed in my work in some ways, is that whereas worship had been the leading keyword of those 4 in my work at Calvin, now formation is the leading keyword. And then that brings me to worship. And I would like to say a little bit about worship in the broad international work related to character formation. And that broad international work, in my view, is stunning. It's, well supported through generous grants from the Templeton Philanthropies, work that Murdoch has done, Lilly Endowment grant funds, Kern funding, each slightly different but complementary. And there are programs in character development in an astonishing range of institutions. And our last December, along with other people who are in this room, some of us were at Wake Forest University for a convening of many of those institutions. And I was amazed, frankly, at the range of institutions where, in many cases, people of lifelong faith were finding this character formation space to be a beautiful way to express their own vocational calling in public universities, in high schools, but also in Christian institutions. What I do find at times missing in that language and character formation internationally is a focus on the central role of Christian practices, means of grace, sacramental participation, and prayer. And any Wesleyan account, any Reformed or Presbyterian account, any Catholic account, any Orthodox account of character formation is going to have a whole lot of emphasis on divine agency and action and our need for help, which means that worship is essential and prayer. So it feels to me that there are at least 5 really central kinds of worship practices that we all need to be paying attention to. And the place I would start is in probably the 100 congregations near our campus where faculty, staff, and students worship. Having their participation in healthy congregations is essential to this work. And most of the really exceptional faculty, staff, leaders are in fact involved in healthy ways and healthy congregations that sustain it. And second, it's people as individuals who feel equipped to say, Lord, I need help today, and do the work with that sense of the Holy Spirit's support. And then third, on a big, complicated campus, that there are small gatherings and places for prayer in different spaces. And I'm thrilled that there's a new prayer space that's being renovated inside of the new medical school building, or that our brand new dean of the School of Business is launching a monthly prayer and worship opportunity, or that previous staff have this wonderful practice called Prayer and Pastries. Happens every month on campus, first thing in the morning, hosted by a different college or unit throughout the university. And so those smaller invitational dimensions are important. And then university-wide opportunities are important. And so this fall we started by saying, how could the prayer usually attributed to St. Francis, the prayer of peace, become our way to pray that soul framework and to make that prominent? And then a fifth thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the role of prayer in public witness. And so I've been in email quite a bit in the last couple weeks thinking about the MLK Day observances that are coming in Nashville and the way that prayer will absolutely be a part of that. And thinking, what's the invitation there for Belmont's participation alongside of students and others at Fisk and Tennessee State, and we can go right on, Trevecca and Lipscomb and Vanderbilt right in town. There's a wonderful service opportunity for those universities together. And then there are opportunities to pray and to sing together that could become a part of that witness. And so there are a lot of amazing things in all 5 categories that are already there, but there are also a lot of opportunities to lean into that going forward.
So just a follow-up question for you. I'm glad you mentioned practices. I think one of the questions that we wrestle with a lot in the university where I serve is, formation takes time. It's a slow, steady, long obedience in the same direction. And it takes space. So when we talk about engaging in spiritual practices and giving college students who think their lives are so insanely busy, which I guess they are, I'd love to hand them off my young children, then we could figure out if they're that busy. But we can sometimes, I think, a college campus, it implicitly goes against the nature of the Christian life steeped in the means of grace. So how do you navigate that?
That's a very big question. And I'm just going to say here some examples of things I'm grateful for. Reverend Susan Pendleton-Jones has taken the lead in saying, how can we find dedicated prayer spaces in different parts of campus? And so there are 4 or 5 that are either actively used or going to be used. Dr. Lisa Weaver has joined our university ministry team and has a weekly midweek manna email that goes out soliciting prayer requests. When the process started this past fall, there was one day toward the end of the semester, I think 50 of those came in, and then a group of faculty, staff, and students will pray their way through that. And for that to be known and recognized and affirmed is pretty beautiful. Belmont has one other beautiful practice I'm grateful for, which is a co-curricular set of requirements. Our core curriculum, general education curriculum, is called BELCORE. It's supplemented with something called WELCORE, which requires student participation in a wide variety of co-curricular events related to financial wellness, artistic engagement in the community, fellowship opportunities. In university ministries, we've had students come in, and this is required then by the time they graduate, for spiritual wellness events. And the ones that have been most meaningful to me have featured us putting our screens away for an hour, taking an extended passage of Scripture, and so the series recently has been called The Scriptural Roots of Soul. So you spend an entire hour with Romans 8 or Colossians 3 and read that text out loud with a group of students together. And so those kind of intentional opportunities, I think, are difference makers. But I just am thrilled to come into a place where those requirements are there, and then to say we have a long way to go, a long, long way to go.
If I could just add one note, because it seems like a minor thing, and yet it's been transformational in some other ways. So Susan and I teach a class called What's Your Why on Purpose for student undergrads from across multiple colleges. And she begins every class with a period of silence and then closes with prayer before we engage in the broader conversation. And then we have faculty from across the campus who are doing small groups around the class. But one of those faculty was a nursing faculty who was really touched by how Susan took a couple of minutes at the beginning of class just to quiet yourself, center yourself, and then close with prayer. So she suggested to the nursing faculty that they all covenant to take 2 minutes at the beginning of class, every class that nursing teaches, to do that. Well, the first reaction of the faculty was this would end the universe as we know it. Nursing students would no longer pass their exams and be licensed to practice the world. It was just cataclysmic. And then they finally decided they'd give it a shot. And what they found was, A, the world continued. B, classes still functioned seemingly well, and they were able to cover the material. But C, they found those 2 minutes at the beginning of class changed the whole nature of class. And that then the nursing faculty started evangelizing other colleagues across the university. And other deans were saying, oh, maybe we can do that in business or in architecture in different colleges. 2 minutes, and it's actually paused and slowed down and changed the nature of conversation amidst all the busyness of students and faculty. The other funny thing was a student in our class who came up to Susan in January following the fall semester, and she said, those 2 minutes at the beginning of What's Your Why changed my life. She said, I just thank you so much. And Susan said, well, thanks. She said, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do now that I don't have the class. It hadn't occurred to her that she maybe could do those 2 minutes on her own without it being structured by somebody else.
So I think that's a great segue into the next question, which, especially in universities where change is hard, and we get set in our ways. So how do you inspire innovation, Greg, at Belmont? And then what are some of the barriers to innovate?
How do I inspire innovation? I guess it's just part of who I am, I guess, the way I frame things. But it was fertile soil. So Belmont's had that kind of innovation spirit. I would say probably I developed this term a number of years ago called traditioned innovation. When I was coming into Belmont, I tried to figure out, okay, what can touch the tradition and the people at Belmont? And I realized that there were actually a number of periods where deep in Belmont's DNA was that innovation spirit. And so I reminded them that whatever we were going to do was not going to be discontinuous with the history that they had before them. And that was really important. And connecting it to that Christ-centered focus and telling the story about the Holy Spirit making all things new, how by conforming us to Christ, the one in whom creation came to be. But there was a lot of DNA that was already at Belmont and openness to it. And it really was a way of trying to put us in a posture of seeing innovation as an ongoing gift and task that's deeply rooted in Scripture, and only God creates out of nothing. The rest of us are always creating out of what's gone before us. And so how do you do that, and how do you do it in life-giving ways? And the gift of framing it in ways that people could see continuity with who Belmont had been, and telling those stories and articulating it, I would say, has been really important. I think Nathan's right. The change fatigue is always an issue. And we're living in a time when everything feels like it's up for grabs, and so people want to cling to something. And so figuring out ways they can cling to good things while also experimenting with new things has been really crucial.
Thank you. John, when you think about the individuals or the institutions that have influenced formation in the education at Belmont, who are some of those people, and what are the institutions?
So this broad international work I alluded to earlier, Jonathan Brandt, thank you for your work in that area, and many others in that space. That's Michael Lamb's work at Wake Forest. There is so much positive energy from a variety of fields of positive psychology, for example, my wife works in. So the virtues feel to me like there is a magnetic pull there. And obviously every experience of cultural travail only heightens the desire that I think so many of us feel toward institutional integrity and care and compassion and honesty and integrity. Beautiful. So all of the resources that have come out related to that certainly have had influence. And then one of the things that heartened me in deciding, whether to make the jump to Nashville was noticing things like how well one of Greg's faculty reading groups responded to Rowan Williams' book, Passions of the Soul. Because perhaps if there's a caution I have about the neo-Aristotelian common grace enthusiasm for virtue, is that there's a lot of sort of quiet self-help in it that is something the Spirit can use. So 6 days ago, the Heisman Trophy winner gave a post-game press conference, and Fernando Mendoza actually used the word stoicism in his post-game press conference. And I thought, here at Duke, Professor Kevin Rowe has to be paying attention to the Heisman quarterback just coming right in his direction. And he talked about delayed gratification and what a beautiful thing the Stoics have given us. Now, I have to tell you, in my own theological formation, Christian Reformed Church, Reformed tradition, when Stoicism is mentioned, we are sort of trained to get out our cannons. literally. I mean, as Marty once asked at Calvin University, who will reload the cannons of Dort? Now, I make that point to say, handling this moment where there is a deep desire for virtue and an upholding of amazing exemplars of virtue and creating programs that want to promote it will thrive, it seems to me, if we can, in ecumenical community, figure out how to actually invite a conversation about how God is at work in all this in ways that are actually constructive and we don't just blow each other up. So the Orthodox bring deification, that language we heard this morning. And sanctification's a pretty important term that comes out of Methodist and actually my own Reformed tradition. And figuring out how to actually ask the question, how do different denominational traditions enter the character formation space in the best possible way is pretty essential. So I'm grateful in my own tradition, philosopher Rebecca DeYoung's book, Glittering Vices on the Seven Deadly Sins, in my view, is an amazing recovery of that classic virtue and vice language, but through an Augustinian lens. You know, it's like you're looking at the Aristotle heritage, but you're making sure to put that Augustinian frame around it. And that would just be one example. And I think that Rowan Williams' Passions of the Soul is a great example, too. And so to me, I think I both described what I see as the landscape, but also the tremendous opportunity. And I'll just say from my point of view, we all need the Wesleyans to step up. It's your moment. So.
I might just add a note to his point about Passions of the Soul. Well, two notes. One was just one of the great delights. So Nathan and I had a strategy that was rooted in a larger vision of institutional transformation that comes actually from a conversation that I had here at Duke with Coach K and a business leader about how you affect culture change, and it was rooted in Coach K's work with the U.S. Olympic team, where he took 4 players out of 15 and affected culture change. And this business leader said, well, you just showed what really happens. You don't need a majority. You don't need as many as you think. You need the square root of the total number of the people in the organization. So if you have 15, you need 4. But if you have 3,600, as this business leader had, partners around the world, you need like 65, which is a lot less than when you think about 3,600. And it actually works, as I've thought about it and seen experiments in that kind of transformation. So Nathan and I thought, let's form a reading group, and if we get about 25 to 30 faculty together over the course of a year and get them talking with each other and on board, if we get the right ones, it'll accelerate a lot, and it has proven true. But we hit Rowan Williams' Passions of the Soul, which looks at the Sermon on the Mount in relation to the 8 deadly sins that eventually got combined into 7. But when we were reading the book, the fascinating thing was one day, before we had the discussion of that book, and we read some other things, Stanley Hauerwas's Letters to a Godson, and N.T. Wright's Simply Christian. It was After You Believe that we read with Tom's. But when I walked in, Nathan and I were there, and we saw a professor of theology, a professor of business law, and a professor of costume design talking to each other. And they come from 3 different traditions: Roman Catholic, Lutheran, and even, Presbyterian, Reformed, and Evangelical. But they were talking, and I thought, this sounds like the beginning of a joke. You know, professor of business law, costume design, and theology walk into a bar. And they were talking about how some insights of Williams in that book were changing how they thought they needed to design their courses. And those were 3 different colleges. And the interesting thing, not one of the 3 of them knew each other before we got them together, but that reading brought them together in that spirit of receptive ecumenism and a transformed pedagogy.
I just want to note, because I think it's so inspiring, just how much communication you've talked about. Just the amount of communication and the trust that creates between faculty and administration to be having conversation, and then to, invite people to deep listening with one another. I think that's so valuable in the day we're living in, and in the anxiety of so many of our institutions. So I'm inspired by that. Thank you. So in regards to Belmont specifically, John talked about who's influencing you. What, Nathan, makes Belmont's Christian, Christ-centered formation unique, and then what do the rest of us have to learn from Belmont specifically?
Yeah, it feels a little. I have a little trepidation as I try to answer that question a little bit, because we're still figuring that out, to be very clear. But I think we have done some things right at the same time. And one of the things I think that is unique about what we're doing, and I get to travel around and interact with a lot of different folks in the character ed movement that John has alluded to. And I just want to give a specific, you mentioned the Wake Forest Program for Leadership and Character. I want to give there's a program under that umbrella called the Educating Character Initiative that I want to commend to you. They're really doing incredible work. I mean, it's become truly a national movement in the States to, I think, kind of do the United States version of what the Jubilee Center and the Oxford Character Project has done in the UK. And so, and they have, because of generous gifts from the Lilly Endowment, they have, and this is all public, but Lilly has invested $70 to $80 million in this initiative, and they have to give half of it away. And so one of those gifts has helped transform our work, and I would just encourage you to check it out for your own institutions. It's really incredible what they're doing there. Anyway, commercial over. But doing this work at an institutional level. So as I go to all these gatherings, convenings of folks in the space, one thing I hear from folks is, honestly, they kind of express this sort of jealousy at times, like this yearning to but you all are doing this institution-wide as opposed to a particular office, right, or a corner of campus, right? Now, and I have to admit very quickly that yes, we are doing that, but we're only able to do that because of support from our senior leadership. I mean, from our president, Greg. This is not something that Greg just allows, but this is deeply resonant with Greg's passions and background, and really in the center of his wheelhouse. And so this, we're only able to do that, I think, at least as quickly at an institutional scale because of that support. But that also leads me to the importance of senior leadership investing in this work, and leadership, regardless of where you're at in the organization, just making this a priority for your institution or your department, whatever the case might be. I think something that we've done a good job of is stating clearly what we're about. Right, like having a crystal clear mission that focuses on formation, hopefully a crystal clear framework that helps us talk about how do we live out that mission, right? And really trying to integrate that language into practice across campus. And one thing that I think's really helped move us along is not discounting storytelling. That's often, I think, especially for those of us who, whether we're theologians or philosophers or just academics, let's just paint a broader, cast a wider net here. We might at times think of storytelling as sort of an afterthought or a lesser than effort to engage in, but it's been huge for us to kind of paint this picture and invest in, quite literally, the T-shirts, right? And the banners and the murals across campus, and inviting students to participate in designing them. And you can't throw a rock on campus. We don't, but you can't throw a rock on campus without hitting someone with the Soul T-shirt on, right? I mean, it has become just as Greg would say, that part of the warp and woof of the institution, because we've invested in the marketing, if you will. And again, we don't see that as an afterthought or lesser than, but essential to actually helping people be more Christ-like, right? They get that excitement, they get that character caught, if you will. And then the last thing I'll say is, and we've alluded to this in other answers, but giving faculty and staff space and incentive to engage in this work. Like, one of the common pieces of feedback that we have heard from naysayers, and I'm sure many of you, some of you maybe are thinking of this where you're sitting right now, like, that sounds great, but I have to teach a 4-4 load, or I have to grade a million. I get it. Those are all valid. And so really trying to be intentional to carve out space, getting support from deans and department chairs, like really from the top down, and helping people get an imagination for, if I just do this a little bit differently, I can invest in this formative education work, but also including it in annual review processes, like tenure and promotion processes, like really putting some skin in the game to make people feel like, that I am getting rewarded, if you will, for engaging in this. And what that has allowed us to do, and this is kind of part B of the last point, like really leaning on those faculty champions. Greg mentioned this square root rule. Like those are the best ambassadors for this work, right? Your trusted English faculty member, your trusted theology faculty member, your trusted person in student formation. Like they are the ones that really has moved the ball down the field, and because they're not the administration, right? Like they don't have to do this, but when they get that excitement, they pass it on. They really have been the best evangelists for this work.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of Brian Yike wrote the article. Where are you, Brian? Here you are, on testimony as metric and storytelling. When the young people on your campus can tell the story of their own formation, then you're starting. That is a metric. For us, deeply embedded in who we are and our identity, that the young people are telling the story, and as they tell the story, as they tell their testimony, the formation is happening within them.
If I could just add a couple of quick notes. First is a shout out to David Gregory, who's sitting up next to Steve, because having a provost who really is willing to push this in the tenure and promotion process and in the dean selection, by this summer, I will have appointed 8 of the 12 deans within 5 years, which is kind of astonishing. But that's a huge opportunity to shape a culture. And the other, at the very minor level about storytelling, is we instituted a university leadership team meeting every other week on Zoom for about 200 to 225 of our senior folks across campus. And we begin it with a devotion, and then right after that is what we call the Belmont Blessing. And it's to lift up exemplars of Christ-centered formation across campus. And it's my favorite time of the weeks, because we often will lift up people who are behind the scenes, landscapers and staff assistants and others. And it's through a nomination process, and somebody else gives a kind of testimony. And then you see over in the chat just dozens of compliments and appreciation of that, and it lifts up that faculty and staff kind of sense that it sometimes is the person whom everybody knows is one of the leaders on campus, and often it's somebody in a much quieter way who's lifted up for their Christ-centered focus and character.
All right. Well, I don't think we have time for questions here, but I think we're on a break next. Is that right? So if you have questions, I'm sure that there is more to learn. So thank you.